is holy ground. Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be faithful to your holy word, O Holy One. Amen. Strolling up the hill from cottage 20, two gentle giants emerged. I had heard about them in the years prior, had learned of their long and abiding friendship with my grandparents McLean. And this year, for the very first time, I would finally meet them. It was the summer of 1970, and this year, for the very first time, I was at Berwick Camp. Everything about it was more magical than I had dared to imagine. Tiny cottages, colorful and rustic, the ancient towering hemlocks, creating a kind of cathedral between the earth and the sky. And the warmth and the quiet graciousness of those two gentle giants, Janet and Gordon Tupper, Anne's beloved parents, toward my little 9-year-old girl, left me enchanted. They seemed as tall as the trees to me, and every bit as beautiful and grand. Enter Anne, 37 years old that summer, and her charming husband with their 3 kids in tow. She too seemed as tall as the trees to me, and I was enthralled with her athletic stride and her wonderful sense of humor as she tore about the camp. Oh my land! You'd hear her exclaim, catching up with friends she'd not seen for a year. Oh my word! You'd hear her bellow, catching up on the news from another. Don't be so foolish! She'd howl, as she'd find herself in the midst of someone else's antics and shenanigans, laughing to beat the band all the while. And to antics and shenanigans, Anne herself was no stranger. As a teenager, 16 or 17 years of age, when her mother and father, Reverend Mr. and Mrs. Tupper, went out to church meetings on a weeknight, Anne made Brother Jim, 5 years her junior, the keeper of the light. She would sneak out of the house to hang out with her friends. And when she came home, she would check out the status of the light in the pantry, which was visible from the backyard. If the light was on, it meant parents are home. Sneak back in. If the light was off, it meant parents are still out. Come in the front door. Style and flair were Anne's middle names. Though she was only 1 year younger than her sister Joyce, who had become a talented seamstress, Anne took no interest in sewing. However, she was eager to suggest both patterns and fabrics with which Joyce should work, and the final outfits were always a smashing success. In her words, Anne was less than charmed when her youngest brother Bruce was born, for fear his arrival might well interfere with her very active social calendar at the age of 14. But she got on board and became, and I quote, ridiculously supportive of her little brother, notwithstanding his sometimes outlandish behavior. For example, when Bruce was dispatched to nurse Anne when the kids were little and she was confined to bed with a bad back, he delivered every single bedpan to her backwards and often filled with ice cubes. Anne, too, seemed as tall as the trees to me, and I was enthralled by her athletic stride and her wonderful sense of humor as she tore about the camp. And soon I noticed that when she wasn't tearing about the camp, she was most often huddled on a cottage stoop or lingering at a table in the dining hall well past the end of her meal, leaning in, listening, and communing with all manner of people, from 9-year-olds to those who were 99. The gay man who could not be out back in the day, who felt safe and affirmed in Anne's presence. The teenager who was struggling with anxiety and depression, who felt more hopeful because of Anne's insight. The elder woman whose beloved husband had died, who found consolation in Anne's concern and in her care. And to cottage stoops and tables in dining halls beyond Berwick, Anne was no stranger. Throughout her long life, Annie, Big Annie, Mom, Mimi, Curry Frog's dear, Big Mama, Big, had a calling intrinsic to her very being, to affirm and to examine and to care. Anne had a tremendous capacity to hold another's pain, to assist others in excavating the roots of their pain, and to remain steadfast in her conviction that in time, with hard work and dogged faith, and by God's grace, that pain could be transformed to bear flower and fruit. She had a tremendous capacity to stay the course with those who were struggling and to innately know when to offer no-nonsense advice or ask the wisest of questions, so that the goodness that she recognized in so many of us was revealed to us in our most desperate of moments. Whether it be over coffee at Tim Hortons, or a coffee at Fernando's Hideaway, whether it be over a cinnamon roll at the bakery, or a sandwich at Wheaton's, or an ice cream cone at the Ottawa House by the sea, or whether it be seated morning, afternoon, or in the middle of the night at her own kitchen table, a safe house of sorts, where there was always an extra chair, a grilled cheese sandwich, and tea in the kettle. Anne was always intrepid and game to settle in. And God only knows, and I say that reverently, how many lives were nurtured and sustained and empowered and no doubt even saved across generations of those with whom she spent her time, from toddlers to teenagers to contemporaries, because of it. And soon I noticed that when she wasn't tearing about the camp, she was most often huddled on a cottage stoop or lingering at a table in the dining hall well past the end of her meal, leaning in, listening, communing with all manner of people, from 9-year-olds to those who were 99. And through all the years since, I have come to understand more deeply, as have countless others, that whether Anne was celebrating the joys, the triumphs of her family, or her friends who became as family, oft-times in recent years with a feed of Chinese food after she declared no more cooking, and don't you dare forget the dumplings, whether she was accompanying her family, or her friends who became as family through life-altering circumstances, through the grief of disease, through the grief of divorce, through the grief of an untimely death. She knew deep within her bones, always, that she was standing on holy ground. She attuned herself for the sake of others and for her own sake to the sacred presence there, from whom each of us is born, to whom each of us will return, and by whom each of us is held. I believe, Anne wrote, that the wild act of living takes a ridiculous amount of focus and of courage. Navigating the whole ordeal with grace and with gratitude and being there for your people is accomplishment enough. And I was fully committed to trying to do that. Strolling up the hill from cottage 20, 2 gentle giants emerged. I had heard about them in the years prior, had learned of their long and abiding friendship with my grandparents from playing. And this year, for the very first time, I would finally meet them. It was the summer of 1970, and this year, for the very first time, I was at Berwick Camp. Everything about it was indeed magical, more so than I could ever have imagined. Tiny cottages, colorful and rustic, the ancient towering hemlocks creating a cathedral between earth and sky. And the warmth and the quiet graciousness of those 2 gentle giants, Anne's beloved parents, toward my little 9-year-old girl, left me enchanted. They seemed as tall as the trees to me, and every bit as beautiful and grand. Enter Anne, 37 years old that summer, and her charming husband and their 3 kids in tow. She too seemed as tall as the trees to me, and I was enthralled. And I began to notice. And in time, with countless others, I came to understand the extraordinary, ordinary life that was hers. Maya Angelou, the magnificent African-American poet, now of blessed memory, writes, "When great trees fall, rocks on distant hills shudder, lions hunker down in tall grasses, and even elephants lumber after safety. When great trees fall in forests, small things recoil into silence, their senses eroded beyond fear. When great souls die, the air around us becomes light, rare, and sterile. We breathe briefly, our eyes briefly see with a hurtful clarity. Our memory, suddenly sharpened, examines, gnaws on kind words unsaid, promised walks never taken. Great souls die, and our reality, bound to them, takes leave of us. Our souls, dependent upon their nurture, now shrink, wizen. Our minds, formed and informed by their radiance, fall away. We are not so much maddened as reduced to the unutterable ignorance of dark, cold caves. And when great souls die, after a period, peace, blooms, slowly and always irregular. Spaces fill with a kind of soothing electric vibration. Our senses, restored, never to be the same, whisper to us. They existed. They existed. We can be and be better, for they existed. Thanks be to God for the life, for the love, for the fullness